My daughter Rachel said I was too dramatic, too needy, and too dependent on others for happiness. So she stopped checking on me, stopped calling regularly, and decided I was perfectly fine managing my loneliness alone. But I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't needy. While she thought I'd quietly accept being forgotten in my empty house, I was already planning to show her what true isolation felt like. This is how I taught the daughter who dismissed my loneliness what it meant to be completely abandoned, and how I made sure she understood the difference between choosing solitude and being left with no one who cares whether you exist. The first sign came during my birthday weekend. I'd hoped Rachel might visit or at least call for a long conversation. Instead, I got a rushed 5-minute call where she sounded like she was in a restaurant. "Sorry, Mom. I'm out with work friends for Jessica's birthday. But happy birthday. Did you do anything special?" I'd spent the day alone, made myself a small cake, watched old movies. "Not really," I said quietly. "That's fine, Mom. You're good at entertaining yourself. Love you, gotta go." Then came Thanksgiving. For 30 years we'd spent it together, just the two of us after her father died. It was our sacred tradition. 2 weeks before, Rachel called with news. "Mom, I've been invited to spend Thanksgiving with Mark's family." Mark was her new boyfriend. "His parents are having this huge family gathering and it's a big step for our relationship." My heart sank. "What about our tradition?" I asked carefully. "Mom, you'll be fine. You can make yourself a nice meal, watch the parade. Maybe invite some neighbors over." I looked around my quiet house, trying to imagine inviting neighbors I barely knew. I don't really know the neighbors well enough for that. Rachel's voice had an edge of impatience. "Then maybe this is a good opportunity to get to know them." "Mom, I can't be your only social connection forever." Christmas was even worse. Rachel came for exactly 24 hours, arriving Christmas Eve and leaving Christmas night. She spent most of the time on her phone, texting Mark, checking work emails. When I tried to show her old photo albums or reminisce about past Christmases, she'd nod absently while scrolling through her phone. "Mom, you've shown me these pictures 100 times." The pattern became clear over the next few months. Rachel would go weeks without calling, then act surprised when I mentioned feeling forgotten. "Mom, I'm living my life. I can't check in every day like when I was a teenager." When I mentioned feeling depressed, spending whole weekends without talking to another person, Rachel would say, "Mom, you need to get out more. Join a club, take a class, do something." I raised Rachel as a single mother after her father died in a car accident when she was 12. The grief nearly destroyed both of us, but I held us together through sheer will and endless love. I worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, coming home exhausted but always finding energy to help with homework, attend school events, and listen to her teenage troubles. Rachel was my whole world after losing my husband. I threw myself into being the perfect mother, driving her to dance classes, sports practices, college visits. When she got into nursing school, I was so proud I cried for days. I paid for her education by working extra shifts and taking out loans I'm still paying off. After graduation, Rachel moved 3 hours away for a good job at a city hospital. I understood completely she needed to build her own life. But the empty house felt enormous without her laughter, without our nightly talks over dinner. I started calling her every day just to hear her voice, to feel connected to the person I'd devoted my life to raising. At first, Rachel was patient. She'd chat about her new job, her apartment, the friends she was making. But gradually, I noticed the calls getting shorter. She'd sound distracted, like she was doing other things while talking to me. When I mentioned feeling lonely in our big house, she'd say, "Mom, you need to make your own friends. You can't depend on me for all your social needs." I tried explaining that after 30 years of focusing entirely on her, I didn't know how to make friends. My nursing colleagues were younger, already had their established groups. The neighbors were polite but distant. Rachel would sigh and say, "Mom, you're a grown woman. Figure it out." I felt like I was slowly disappearing, becoming invisible to the one person who mattered most. The breaking point came on a particularly dark February evening. I hadn't spoken to another human being in 4 days. The grocery store clerk didn't count. She'd barely looked at me while scanning my items. I tried calling Rachel twice that week, but both calls went to voicemail. She hadn't called back. I was sitting in my kitchen looking at the dinner I'd made for one, when the silence became unbearable. The house felt like a tomb. I could hear every creak, every settling sound, magnified by the emptiness. I called Rachel again, desperate to hear a familiar voice, to feel like I existed in someone's world. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding annoyed. "Mom, what's wrong now?" The words hit me like a slap. What's wrong now? Like I was some kind of chronic complainer, a burden she had to manage. "I just wanted to talk to someone," I said, my voice small. "I've been alone for days and I just needed to hear your voice." Rachel sighed heavily. "Mom, this has to stop. You can't call me every time you feel lonely. I have my own life, my own problems. Mark and I are having issues, work is crazy stressful, and I don't have the emotional energy to manage your feelings too." The word manage cut deep. My feelings were something she had to manage, not something she cared about. "I'm not asking you to manage anything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to feel like I mattered to someone. Like someone would notice if I disappeared." Rachel's response was swift and cutting. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. You're fine on your own. You've always been independent and strong. This helpless act doesn't suit you." Helpless act. She thought my loneliness was an act, a performance designed to get attention. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Rachel explaining all the ways my loneliness was my own fault, my own choice, my own problem to solve. She used phrases like codependent and emotional manipulation, words that felt like weapons aimed at the love I'd given her unconditionally for decades. When she finally hung up, promising to talk later when you're being more rational, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. That night, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. If Rachel truly believed I was fine alone, then I would show her exactly what that looked like. I would disappear so completely from her life that she'd finally understand the difference between choosing to be alone and being abandoned by everyone who's supposed to love you. The next morning, I began the systematic process of disappearing from Rachel's life. It had to be gradual, strategic, completely unlike my usual behavior. Rachel expected me to call, to reach out, to be the one maintaining our connection. I would stop, but in a way that looked natural, not spiteful. First, I stopped calling entirely. When Rachel inevitably called me a week later, I kept the conversation brief and distant. "Oh, hi Rachel. How are things?" When she asked why I hadn't called, I said simply, "I've been busy." I didn't elaborate, didn't explain what I was busy with. I just let the silence stretch until she filled it with talk about her own life. The key was changing my entire response pattern without explanation. For 30 years, I'd been the one asking questions, showing interest, remembering details of her life. Now I became politely distant. When she told me about work drama, I said, "That sounds difficult," instead of asking follow-up questions. When she mentioned plans with Mark, I said, "That's nice," instead of wanting to hear every detail. I started building a life that had nothing to do with Rachel, but I didn't tell her about it. I joined a grief support group at the hospital where I worked, not because I needed help with David's death, but because I needed to learn how other people managed loneliness. I started volunteering at the animal shelter on weekends, finding comfort in caring for abandoned creatures who appreciated attention. Most importantly, I began keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Rachel, documenting exactly how she responded to my loneliness, how she dismissed my needs, how she made me feel like a burden for wanting connection with my only child. I wasn't planning revenge exactly, but I was building evidence of her complete lack of empathy for my situation. I also started making practical changes to my living situation. I began researching retirement communities not because I wanted to move, but because I wanted to understand my options for building a life without Rachel as my primary connection. Within 2 months, I'd become someone Rachel didn't recognize, distant, busy, unavailable for her usual pattern of brief, obligatory check-ins. The beauty of my approach was that I was using her own words against her. Every time she told me to be more independent, to stop being needy, to figure out my own social life, I was now doing exactly that, but in a way that completely excluded her from the results. She'd wanted me to be fine alone, and I was going to show her just how fine I could be without her. My plan went into full effect during spring when Rachel started noticing the changes in our dynamic. She'd call expecting our usual pattern, me asking about her life, her work, her relationship, her weekend plans. Instead, she got polite but minimal responses and no reciprocal interest in maintaining the conversation. "Mom, you seem different lately," she said during one of our increasingly brief calls. "More distant or something." I responded calmly, "I'm not distant, Rachel. I'm just following your advice about being more independent and not relying on you for emotional support." She paused, clearly not expecting that response. "I didn't mean you should stop caring about my life." I let silence stretch before saying, "I do care. I hope things are going well for you." The shift confused her because she'd never had to work to maintain our relationship. For decades, I'd done all the emotional labor, remembering important dates, asking about her concerns, offering support and advice. Now she was experiencing what most adult relationships actually required: mutual effort and genuine interest from both parties. My volunteer work at the animal shelter became my primary social outlet, and I made genuine friends there. Maria, a retired teacher whose husband had died 5 years earlier, understood exactly what I was going through. Tom, a widower who volunteered with the dogs, became someone I could talk to about the pain of being dismissed by adult children who thought their parents should be content with isolation. These friends provided what Rachel had refused to give: genuine interest in my daily life, empathy for my struggles, and reciprocal emotional support. When Maria asked about my week, she actually listened to my answer and remembered details for next time. When I mentioned feeling hurt by Rachel's dismissal of my loneliness, Tom shared his own experiences with children who expected their parents to be self-sufficient while offering nothing in return. I started planning activities that would make me genuinely unavailable when Rachel called. I took watercolor painting classes on Tuesday evenings, joined a book club that met Thursday afternoons, and committed to weekend volunteer shifts at the shelter. For the first time in decades, I had a schedule that didn't revolve around being accessible to Rachel whenever she felt like connecting. The change became apparent to Rachel during her birthday in May. For 30 years, I'd made a huge deal about her birthday: elaborate cards, thoughtful gifts, long phone calls reminiscing about the day she was born and how proud I was of the woman she'd become. This year, I sent a simple card with a gift card to a restaurant and called to say, "Happy birthday, honey. I hope you have a lovely day." The summer brought the ultimate test of my new approach. Rachel and Mark broke up after a tumultuous 2-year relationship, and she called me crying, expecting the comfort and support I'd always provided during her romantic crises. This time, I listened politely for about 10 minutes, offered appropriate sympathy, and then mentioned that I needed to go because I was meeting Tom for dinner. Rachel was clearly shocked. "Mom, Mark and I just broke up. This is a really hard time for me." I responded calmly, "I understand and I'm sure you'll get through it. You're strong and resilient, just like you always told me I was." By early fall, Rachel was calling me 2 or 3 times a week, clearly struggling with the distance between us but unable to articulate why. She'd never had to work to maintain our relationship or deal with me being emotionally unavailable. The final phase came during the holidays when I made plans for Thanksgiving that didn't include waiting hopefully for Rachel to visit or call. When she asked about working around my schedule, I said, "I don't think so. These are important commitments I've made to people who count on me." The complete reversal of our relationship dynamic became undeniable during the holiday season. Rachel, who had spent months dismissing my loneliness and telling me to build my own life, was now the one desperately trying to maintain connection with someone who had become politely distant and consistently unavailable. She called me the week before Thanksgiving, and for the first time in our relationship, I heard genuine anxiety in her voice when discussing our plans. "Mom, I know you said you're busy, but Thanksgiving has always been our special time together. Can't you change your volunteer schedule just this once?" The irony was breathtaking. For months, she'd refused to adjust her social schedule to include me, dismissing my requests for connection as neediness and drama. Now she was asking me to rearrange my commitments for her emotional needs. I responded with the same gentle firmness she'd used on me. "Rachel, these people at the shelter are counting on me. I can't just abandon my commitments because it's convenient for you. Surely you understand that." The words were almost identical to what she'd said when I'd asked her to visit during my lonely weekends, just reversed. On Thanksgiving morning, I got 3 calls from Rachel. I was genuinely busy serving dinner to homeless families, but even if I hadn't been, I wouldn't have been available for the kind of long, emotional conversation she seemed to want. When I finally called her back that evening, exhausted but fulfilled from a day of meaningful service, she sounded lost. "Mom, this was our first Thanksgiving apart in 30 years, she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I kept thinking you'd call earlier or ask me to come help with your volunteer work or something. I spent the day alone in my apartment eating Chinese takeout." The image was painfully familiar. It was exactly how I'd spent dozens of weekends while she was busy with her own life. "I'm sorry you had a difficult day," I said with the same tone of polite sympathy she'd used when I described my lonely weekends. "But you're strong and independent. I'm sure you'll be fine." I was using her own words, her own philosophy about emotional self-sufficiency, to respond to her distress. The Christmas season brought an escalation in Rachel's attempts to reconnect, but also a growing awareness of how completely our roles had reversed. She started calling more frequently, but I was often unavailable at book club, painting class, dinner with Tom and Maria, weekend trips with my new social circle. When she did reach me, our conversations were brief and focused on logistics rather than the deep emotional connection she seemed to be seeking. "Mom, I feel like I don't know what's going on in your life anymore," she said during one December call. "You used to tell me everything, and now I hear about your activities after the fact, if at all." I responded calmly, "I'm living my life, Rachel. Isn't that what you wanted? For me to be independent and not rely on you for emotional support." The question hung in the air because we both knew she couldn't object to me doing exactly what she'd demanded for months. She'd insisted I build my own social circle, find my own activities, stop depending on her for connection. Now that I'd done precisely that, she was experiencing the natural consequence. I no longer needed her to feel fulfilled, and I no longer prioritized her needs above my own well-being. Christmas Eve brought the moment I'd been building toward for months. Rachel called, clearly expecting some version of our traditional long conversation about Christmas memories, family traditions, and plans for the future. Instead, she got 15 minutes of polite small talk before I mentioned I needed to prepare for Christmas dinner with my new friends. "Christmas dinner with friends?" she asked, sounding genuinely shocked. "But we always spend Christmas together, even if it's just on the phone." I paused thoughtfully before responding. "Rachel, you've spent this entire year teaching me that I can't depend on one person for all my emotional needs. You were right. It's healthier for me to have multiple meaningful relationships rather than putting all my emotional energy into someone who finds my need for connection burdensome." The silence that followed was profound. For the first time, Rachel was hearing her own philosophy reflected back to her in a way that excluded her from its benefits. She'd wanted me to be emotionally independent, and I'd become exactly that, independent of her, no longer prioritizing her needs above my own happiness, no longer available for her convenience. "Mom, that's not what I meant," she finally said, her voice small. "I just didn't want you to be so dependent on me for everything. I didn't mean for you to replace me with other people." The statement revealed the fundamental selfishness of her position. She'd wanted me to stop needing her emotional support without losing my availability to provide emotional support to her. She'd wanted the benefits of having a devoted mother without the responsibility of being a caring daughter. "I understand," I said gently, "but you taught me that emotional dependency isn't healthy. So I've learned to get my needs met through multiple relationships with people who actually want to provide mutual support." It's exactly what you suggested I should do. New Year's Eve provided the ultimate demonstration of how completely our dynamic had shifted. In previous years, Rachel would make her party plans without considering whether I'd be spending the evening alone, occasionally calling me briefly around midnight if she remembered. This year, she called me at 7 p.m., clearly hoping for a long conversation to help her through what was apparently going to be a lonely evening at home. I was getting ready for a New Year's Eve party with my volunteer friends, genuine celebration with people who'd become important to me over the past year. "I can't talk long tonight, Rachel. I'm meeting friends for dinner and then we're going to a community center dance. It should be fun." The casual mention of plans she wasn't invited to, activities she knew nothing about, and friendships she'd never heard of clearly unsettled her. "Mom, slow down," she said, sounding overwhelmed. "When did you become so busy? When did you start having all these friends and activities? I feel like I don't know you anymore." The complaint was identical to what I'd felt for months as she'd built her own life while dismissing my desire to be included in it. "I took your advice," I said simply. "You told me repeatedly that I needed to build my own social life instead of depending on you for companionship. So I did. These are people I've met through volunteering in classes. They've become very important to me." The emphasis on "very important" was intentional. She needed to understand that I'd found people who valued my company and reciprocated my care. January brought a series of increasingly desperate phone calls from Rachel as she began to fully grasp what had happened to our relationship. She'd call wanting to have the kind of long, intimate conversations we'd shared for years, but I was consistently unavailable for that level of emotional intimacy. I'd become polite but distant, caring but not invested, supportive but not particularly interested in the details of her daily struggles. "Mom, I miss you," she said during one particularly emotional call. "I miss talking to you the way we used to. I miss feeling close to you." The words were heartbreaking because I knew exactly how she felt. It was precisely what I'd been trying to tell her for months before giving up and building a life without her at its center. "I'm still here," I replied calmly. "We're talking right now." But we both knew it wasn't the same. I was no longer emotionally available to her in the way she'd taken for granted. I was no longer organizing my schedule around her needs or prioritizing her emotional well-being above my own. "But it's different," she insisted. "You're different. It's like you don't really care about my life anymore." The accusation was accurate and I didn't deny it. "Rachel, you spent months teaching me that caring too much about someone else's life wasn't healthy. You called it dependency and neediness. You told me I should be fine on my own, that I was strong enough to handle loneliness. I learned those lessons very well." The conversation ended with Rachel crying, but I didn't comfort her the way I once would have. She was experiencing the natural consequence of dismissing someone's emotional needs. Eventually, that person stops offering emotional support in return. She taught me that loneliness was something I should handle independently, and now she was learning to handle her own loneliness the same way. February brought what felt like a breaking point in our transformed relationship. Rachel called me on Valentine's Day, clearly struggling with being single and apparently expecting me to provide the emotional support that had always been her backup plan when romantic relationships failed. Instead, she found me rushing off the phone because I had dinner plans with Tom, who'd become a genuine friend and companion. "Mom, can't your friend wait a few minutes?" she asked, sounding genuinely distressed. "I'm having a really hard time today and I just need to talk to someone who cares about me." The request was reasonable, but it was exactly the kind of request she'd dismissed when our roles were reversed. I'd asked her countless times to stay on the phone a few extra minutes when I was lonely, only to be told she was busy with more important plans. "Rachel, Tom is expecting me and I don't want to keep him waiting," I said, using the same tone of regret but firmness she'd used on me. "I'm sure you'll be fine. You're strong and resilient and you have other friends you can call." The suggestion that she call other friends was particularly cutting because I'd never had other friends to call. She'd been my primary relationship, the person I'd depended on for emotional connection. March brought an attempt by Rachel to address our changed dynamic directly. She called and asked if we could have a serious conversation about what's happening between us. I agreed, curious to see if she'd gained any insight into her own behavior over the past year. "Mom, I know things have been different between us lately," she began carefully. "I feel like you're punishing me for something, but I don't understand what I did wrong." The assumption that my independence was punishment rather than self-protection revealed how little she understood about the impact of her previous behavior. "I'm not punishing you, Rachel," I said calmly. "I'm doing exactly what you taught me to do, living my own life, building my own relationships, and not depending on you for emotional support. Isn't this what you wanted?" The question forced her to confront the logic of her own position. "I wanted you to be more independent," she said slowly, "but I didn't want to lose our close relationship. I didn't want you to stop caring about my life or stop being available when I need support." The statement perfectly encapsulated the selfishness of her original position. She'd wanted me to be emotionally self-sufficient while remaining emotionally available to her. "Rachel," I said gently, "for months I tried to explain that I was lonely and needed more connection with you. Every time I expressed that need, you told me I was being dramatic, needy, and dependent. You insisted I should be fine alone. So I learned to be fine alone. The problem is, being fine alone means I don't need you the way I used to." There was a long silence before she spoke again, her voice very small. "I didn't realize that's how I made you feel. I thought you were just, I don't know, going through a phase or something. I didn't think you were really as lonely as you said." The admission was both vindicating and heartbreaking. "I was exactly as lonely as I said," I replied. "But you convinced me that my loneliness was my own problem to solve, not something you should have to care about. So I solved it by building relationships with people who actually want to provide mutual emotional support. The difference is, these new relationships don't include you." The final phase of my plan came to completion in April when Rachel made one last desperate attempt to restore our previous dynamic. She called to tell me she'd been thinking about moving back home, maybe finding a job at the local hospital so we could spend more time together. It was exactly what I'd fantasized about hearing for months before I'd given up and built my own life. "That's nice, dear," I said with polite disinterest. "I'm sure you'll make the decision that's right for your career." The response clearly wasn't what she'd expected. In the past, I would have been overjoyed at the prospect of having her closer, would have offered to help her job search, would have started planning all the ways we could spend time together. "Mom, don't you want me to move home?" she asked, sounding genuinely confused. I thought you'd be excited about us being closer. The question revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental change in our relationship. Rachel, I've built a good life here with friends who care about me and activities that fulfill me. If you moved back, you'd be welcome to be part of that life if you wanted to, but I'm not going to rearrange everything I've built around your schedule and needs. Those days are over. The conversation ended with Rachel realizing that she'd successfully achieved her goal of making me independent. But independence meant I was no longer available to center my life around her emotional needs. She'd wanted a mother who didn't require attention and care, and she'd gotten exactly that. The problem was she'd also lost a mother who was willing to provide unlimited attention and care in return. 2 years have passed since I systematically withdrew from Rachel's life to show her what real abandonment felt like. Our relationship now exists in a space that neither of us could have predicted. We're polite, we're distant, and we're both fundamentally changed by what happened between us. Rachel eventually stopped trying to restore our old dynamic once she realized I wasn't punishing her temporarily, but had genuinely moved on to a life that didn't revolve around her needs. She found a therapist who helped her understand how dismissive she'd been of my emotional needs, but understanding and changing are different things. The damage to our relationship was so complete that insight couldn't repair it. She did move back to our city, taking a job at the local hospital just 20 minutes from my house. But instead of the reunion she'd hoped for, she discovered that proximity doesn't restore intimacy. I was friendly when she called, polite when we met for occasional coffee, but I was no longer the devoted mother whose life centered entirely around her happiness and well-being. My social life flourished in ways I'd never imagined possible. Tom became a genuine companion. We took weekend trips together, shared daily walks, and developed the kind of easy friendship I'd never had time for when all my emotional energy went to Rachel. Maria and I started a grief support group for parents whose adult children had emotionally abandoned them. We discovered there were dozens of women in our community who'd experienced similar dismissal from children they'd devoted their lives to raising. The volunteer work at the animal shelter became a source of profound meaning. Caring for abandoned creatures who appreciated attention and returned affection freely helped me understand that love should be reciprocal, not one-sided. The dogs didn't take my care for granted or dismiss my need for connection as neediness. They simply loved back as fully as they were loved. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before Rachel dismissed my loneliness as drama and neediness. That woman had spent decades believing that unconditional love meant accepting conditional treatment in return. She'd confused being needed with being valued, confused sacrifice with love. She'd thought that pouring everything into one relationship would guarantee that relationship would sustain her when she needed it most. The woman I became understands that emotional independence doesn't mean not needing love. It means not accepting scraps of attention from people who should care about your well-being. It means building relationships with people who see your need for connection as natural and healthy, not as weakness or manipulation. Rachel learned painful lessons too. She learned that dismissing someone's loneliness doesn't make it disappear. It just makes that person find comfort elsewhere. She discovered that taking someone's devotion for granted doesn't preserve it forever. It eventually exhausts the person giving it. Most importantly, she learned that you can't have unlimited access to someone's emotional support while offering nothing in return. Our new relationship isn't what either of us would have chosen, but it's honest. I no longer pretend that being chronically dismissed and emotionally neglected is acceptable because it comes from my daughter. She no longer assumes that I'll be endlessly available for her needs while my own needs remain invisible. The notebook I kept during those dark months sits in my desk drawer now, filled with documentation of every time she'd minimized my loneliness, every occasion she'd called my need for connection dramatic or needy. I don't read it often, but it reminds me that patterns of dismissal don't change just because we love someone. Sometimes the people we love most need to experience real consequences before they understand the impact of their choices. Emma, Tom's granddaughter, comes to the shelter sometimes and asks about my daughter. "Do you miss her?" she asked me recently. I thought carefully before answering. "I miss who I thought she was," I said finally. "But I don't miss feeling invisible and unimportant in her life." That's the truth Rachel will have to live with. She wanted me to be fine alone, and I learned to be exactly that, fine without her constant criticism of my emotional needs, fine without her dismissal of my loneliness, fine without centering my entire world around someone who saw my love as a burden rather than a gift. They thought they could ignore my loneliness because I was supposed to be fine managing it alone. They had no idea they were teaching me to be fine managing everything alone, including my relationship with them. When I finally showed her what alone really meant, she learned the difference between independence and abandonment, between choosing solitude and being left by the people who are supposed to care whether you exist. And in that painful isolation she dismissed in me, she finally understood what I'd been trying to tell her all along. That being strong doesn't mean you don't need love, and being self-sufficient doesn't mean you deserve to be emotionally neglected by your own child.